building an indie business in the center of venture capital. I'm Alex Edmonds, and this is Building an Indie Business podcast. Okay, I love that intro. Today, I'll be discussing using your podcast as a lead magnet. So I'm going to talk about what is a lead magnet, why you should use your podcast as a lead magnet, how to use your podcast as a lead magnet, the advantages, the disadvantages, and who this doesn't apply to. Okay, so let's get started. Actually, before we get started, I want to just bring up the survey, which will be in the show notes. This is just questions I have for listeners of the podcast to answer. I think it's 10 just multiple choice questions and then 2 short answer questions. You can finish it real quick. Okay, so let's get into it. What is a lead magnet? The definition of a lead magnet from my Google search is a lead magnet is an incentive that marketers offer to potential buyers in exchange for their email. So a lead magnet would be an alternative to advertising on the podcast. Okay, so why do you want to use your podcast as a lead magnet? Because ads take away from the focus of your content. When you have an ad on your podcast, you have to stop what you're saying and talk about another brand on your podcast. So someone might get distracted or turn off your podcast as soon as they hear an ad from another company. Another reason why is because when you don't have ads on your podcast, this provides more value to your listeners. So if you have an hour-long podcast and you have 10 minutes of ads, you're only providing 50 minutes of value for your listeners. So by not having ads, you can provide more value to them. Okay. How to use your podcast as a lead magnet? Well, the first thing you can do is to build your personal brand. So if you're trying to establish yourself in an industry, you can start podcasting and let people know your thoughts on the industry, and people will see or hear your thoughts and listen for your thoughts if they like what you have to say. Another way you can use your podcast is as an extension of your product. So let's say you are trying to break into the podcast industry and you want to sell a podcast product. You can talk about podcasting, and people will see that you have knowledge about it and maybe want to use your product because of your influence in the podcast industry. Okay. Another way you can use your podcast is to give information about your industry. So you can give information about your industry, and then people will think about your product when people they need your product. So you can talk about the science of something, like, okay, you could talk about cars and using cars in movies if you're in the movie industry, and then you can sell prop cars for movies. And so when people think cars and movies, people then think of your product. Okay, so the advantages of using your podcast as a lead magnet. The first advantage that you will have is that you would have less to manage with the podcast, and you can focus more on your content. So when you have advertisers, you have to deal with advertisers, and that takes away focus from your content because you have to focus on their content and making sure they're happy. Another thing that gives you the advantage is when you're not focused on advertisers, your subscriber count or your download count doesn't matter, because that you have no one to please with your podcast. When you have an advertiser, they want to know how many subscribers you have and how many downloads you have. With a lead magnet for a podcast, you can just focus on content and don't have to pay attention to those numbers. Another advantage is you don't have to worry about saying something a sponsor doesn't like. You're censorship resistant, as I would say. So if you can say whatever you want. So on my podcast, I don't like to cuss, specifically because there's little kids listening to my podcast. I know that for a fact. My younger family members, and I don't want to hear it from their parents if they hear me swear. And another reason is because when you swear on your podcast, it doesn't show up in other countries like India. So I just avoid all that with not swearing. But if you okay, I have a perfect example. Bill Burr, he has advertisers, and there was one incident where he's selling berries, and he made fun of their product, and they didn't like that, so he had to. They cut the relationship with them, and so they later re-engaged him or started advertising on his podcast, and he was very careful with the next ad that he did. So if he didn't have advertisers, he wouldn't have to worry about that. Okay. The next advantage that I think you will have is it'll give you an edge against other podcasts. So a lot of people are tired of being sold something, and by not selling ads, you're giving people something that they can consume without being sold something. The next thing, so because you're not selling them something, I think that this will create more loyal listeners, because some people don't want to be sold ads, and they'll look forward to hearing your podcast. Okay, so another advantage is that people probably don't want to hear so many advertisements for a subscription for underwear, and so you'll be that podcast without the underwear ad, and that could give you an advantage. Okay. The disadvantages. You lose a source of income, a potential source of income, because you won't be monetizing your podcast directly. And so you'll be losing potential money, because if your podcast grows and companies want to advertise, you have to say no to them. Okay. The next thing you want, or another disadvantage, is that it may be difficult to track your listener conversions. So it'll be hard to track whether your listeners are converting to using your product. And this is because this goes back to how to use your podcast. People will think of your product when people need it. So if you're targeting producers of movies for your car company, those people will think about your product when they need it. So they might not need your product right away. So it'd be kind of hard to track when a listener converts to using your product. So this makes your product difficult, or it makes it kind of difficult to track the impact of your podcast. Okay, so finally, this doesn't apply to full-time podcasters. If you have a full-time podcast, or if your podcast is your product then you have to sell ads to make money on the podcast. So this doesn't apply to full-time podcasters. Okay, that's all I have for this episode. Thank you for listening. If you want to host a podcast and you don't want the hassle of setting it up and everything, join the Telegram chat for Open Podcast, and we talk to me, and we will set something up where you host an episode of the Open Podcast community podcast. Okay. Thanks for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.